Before the war, she'd never held a paycheck with her own name on it. Before the war, no one asked what she wanted to do with her life. They only asked when she was getting married. And before the war, in 26 states across this country, if a woman did have a job, the moment she said "I do" at the altar, that job was legally taken away from her. Just like that, no appeal, no negotiation, just gone. Now here is the question that kept me up thinking about this story. What happens to a woman when a world war hands her freedom she was never supposed to have, and then 4 years later asks her to simply hand it back? That is the story we're going to sit with tonight, slowly, quietly, together. But first, if you found your way to this video tonight, whether you're already tucked into bed, lying on your couch with the lights turned down, or somewhere out there in the world just needing a quiet story to carry you through, I just want to say I am really glad you are here. If the stories I bring to this channel have ever made your nights feel a little softer, a little more interesting, maybe even a little more meaningful, then like a share or a quiet subscription means more than, it is honestly the small thing that lets me keep doing this. And I would love to know, where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments below. A city, a country, a cozy corner of your house, whatever feels right. Now let us make this feel exactly the way it should. Lights low, maybe a fan humming gently in the background, and nowhere else you need to be. Let us begin. Imagine for a moment that you are a young woman. The year is 1938. You are 21 years old. You live in a mid-sized American city, maybe Ohio, maybe Pennsylvania, maybe somewhere in the South where the magnolias bloom thick in July. You went to high school. You're sharp, maybe even the sharpest girl in your graduating class. A few of your teachers quietly said so. But here is the thing, nobody asked what you wanted to do with that sharpness, because the path was already laid out for you the way a table is set before guests arrive. You already knew what plate was yours before you even sat down. You would work for a year or two, maybe a secretary, a telephone operator, a clerk in a department store. Something appropriate, something temporary, something that filled the years between school and the altar. And then you would marry, probably by 21 or 22. Statistics from that era confirm it in 1930. The median age at first marriage for American women was just 21.5 years old. 21, not because women were in a rush necessarily, but because the entire social architecture of their world told them that was simply when the next chapter started. After that, the job was almost certainly over, not because you chose to leave, but because the law in many places would make that choice for you. By 1940, 26 states had what were called marriage bars, legal restrictions that prohibited married women from holding government jobs. And in the private sector, the unwritten rules were just as iron. Banks, schools, insurance companies. The moment a woman's marital status changed, so did her employment status. Done. Finished. Back to the home you go. There was even a federal law, Section 213 of the Economy Act of 1932, that required the government to fire one member of every married couple working in federal service. And since women's salaries were reliably lower than their husbands, the woman went. Every single time. Some women, and this part genuinely stunned me when I first read it, some women kept their marriages secret. They wore no rings to work. They went by their maiden names in the office even after standing at the altar on a Saturday afternoon, because the alternative was losing the one thing that felt like theirs, a paycheck, a desk, a reason to leave the house that wasn't about someone else. Now I want you to sit with that image for a second. A woman hiding her own wedding ring in her coat pocket every morning before she walked through the office door, not because she was ashamed of her husband, but because she was terrified of losing herself. That is not a small thing. That is a woman who already understood on some deep level that the world was asking her to disappear, and who was not entirely willing to go. But let us be fair to the complexity here, because this is not simply a story about women suffering in silence. That would be too easy. The truth is more textured than that. Many women in the 1930s genuinely did find meaning in the home, There was craft in it. Real craft. Managing a household during the Great Depression, stretching a pot of beans into 3 meals, keeping children clean and schooled when money was vanishing, was not a small achievement. It required the kind of daily problem-solving that any CEO today would recognize. Women's magazines of the era, and there were many with enormous readerships, framed domestic work as a kind of artistry. Making home beautiful, making husband comfortable, making children thrive. It was presented in the language of the time as a woman's highest calling. And many women believed it, not because they were foolish, but because when every single voice around you, your mother, your church, your neighbours, your government, your magazine rack, when every single one of those voices tells you the same story, it becomes very hard to hear a different one. There is a word psychologists sometimes use for this. They call it a prescribed life. A life that is handed to you so completely, so early, so consistently that it genuinely begins to feel like a life you chose. In 1938, the vast majority of American women were living prescribed lives. And here is the heartbreaking part of it: many of them would not even discover what they had been missing, until something from the outside, something enormous and terrible, came along and tore the script apart. That something was, of course, World War II, but we are not there yet, because I want you to feel the full weight of the world before the war arrived. By the late 1930s, roughly 1 in 4 employed women was married. That number sounds higher than you might expect, and it is because millions of women were working out of sheer necessity. The Great Depression had knocked the income out of so many households that a second earner was not a luxury, it was survival. But here is what is crucial to understand: even those women, the ones who were already working, faced a ceiling so low they could almost touch it with their heads down. The jobs available to women were channeled into an extraordinarily narrow range. By 1940, researchers found that roughly 90% of all women's work could be sorted into just 10 occupational categories: teaching, nursing, clerical work, domestic service. And for black women and women of colour, even those narrow categories shrank further, often down to just 1: someone else's kitchen, someone else's children, someone else's floor to scrub. The wage gap was not subtle. Women earned on average somewhere between 50 and 60% of what men made for the same or comparable work, and nobody particularly pretended otherwise. It was considered normal. It was considered natural. It was considered, frankly, appropriate, because the assumption baked into every employment contract was that a woman was only passing through the workforce temporarily on her way to her real destination, home, and so the economy arranged itself around that assumption. Women were paid like guests, not permanent residents. But here is what history books tend to skip over the inner lives of those women. Not the legislation, not the statistics. The actual texture of what it felt like to be 22 years old, smart and capable and hungry for something more in a world that had already decided what you were for. We have diaries from this period, letters, oral histories collected years later by researchers who sat across from these women when they were in their 60s and 70s, finally old enough perhaps to say what they had not said at 20. And what comes through again and again is this particular quality of restlessness. Not rage, not yet. Not even a fully formed sense of injustice. Just a kind of quiet, persistent itching. A feeling that something was not quite right without the vocabulary to name what that something was. One woman interviewed decades later by a historian at an Ohio university described her life in the late 1930s this way: "I thought I was happy. I think I probably was in a way. But there was always this feeling like I was waiting for something. Like there was a room in the house I had never been allowed to go into, and I didn't even know what was inside it. A room in the house she had never been allowed to go into." I find that image almost unbearably precise, because that is exactly what it was. Not an absence of love, not a bad marriage necessarily, not even conscious unhappiness. Just a door, a closed door, and a woman standing in the hallway not quite sure she was allowed to knock. Then in September of 1939 the world exploded, And everything, every single prescribed path, every unspoken rule, every closed door, began to shake. The war, when it arrived in America's backyard after December of 1941, did not ask women politely. It did not suggest they might consider stepping up if it wasn't too much trouble, if they didn't mind if it fit into their schedule. It needed them, urgently, immediately, at scale. And for the first time in the history of this country, a woman who had spent her entire adult life being told to wait for marriage, to wait for permission, to wait for someone else to lead, was told instead, "Come, now, we need what you have." What happened next, inside those factory doors, inside those uniforms, inside those women themselves, is a story that moves a great deal slower than a war. But I think it might be the more important one. That is where we are going next. There is a particular kind of moment in history, one that does not announce itself with trumpets or fireworks, but arrives quietly, almost sideways, slipping through the back door of ordinary life, before anyone quite realizes the world has shifted. The winter of 1941 into 1942 was one of those moments. Pearl Harbor had just happened. December the 7th, 1941. A Sunday morning. Families still in their bathrobes, radios clicking on across the country. And then that voice, that urgent, disbelieving voice cutting through every living room, every diner, every church that had not yet let out, telling Americans that the war they had been watching from a careful ocean-wide distance had just come to their doorstep. What followed was a mobilization unlike anything this country had ever seen. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands of men were enlisting, then hundreds of thousands more. By the end of 1942, millions of American men had either enlisted or been drafted. They left their factory floors, they left their office desks, they left their farms, they left in enormous quantities the machinery of an entire industrial economy, and the machinery kept needing to run. In the early months of 1942, economists at the Bureau of Labor Statistics looked at the numbers and arrived at a conclusion so stark it almost defies description. If nothing changed, if no new source of labor was found, the United States would face a shortage of 6 million workers by the end of 1943. 6 million. Enough to grind production to a halt. Enough to lose the war not on a battlefield somewhere far away, but right here in the factories and shipyards of the American heartland. And someone in Washington, someone's actually looked at that number, looked around at who was left and said, "The answer is women." Now I want you to understand what a genuinely radical statement that was. Not because women were incapable. The women had been capable all along. But because the entire cultural and legal architecture of the previous 20 years had been built on the opposite assumption, the assumption that women belonged in certain rooms and not in others, that certain tools were not meant for their hands, that certain decisions were not meant for their minds, and now suddenly urgently the same government that had spent years codifying their domestic role needed them to abandon it, needed them in the shipyards, needed them on the assembly lines, needed them frankly to save the country. And here is the part that I find genuinely fascinating, because this was not simply a polite suggestion. The government didn't put out a quiet memo and hope women would notice. They launched a campaign, one of the most sophisticated propaganda campaigns in American advertising history. The War Advertising Council, working with the Office of War Information, created what historians later described as the most successful recruitment campaign the United States had ever run. Posters, magazine ads, radio spots, newsreels. The message was everywhere, and it was deliberately carefully crafted to do two things at once: make war work feel patriotic and make it feel this part is the key. Make it feel compatible with being a woman. Because the government knew something. They knew you could not just tell a woman whose entire identity had been shaped around domesticity to suddenly pick up a rivet gun. Not without changing the story first. So they changed the story. The song came first, actually. In 1942, two songwriters named Red Evans and John Jacob Loeb wrote a tune that became a national hit. It was called Rosie the Riveter, and the Rosie in the song was not some abstract ideal. She was inspired by a real woman, a 19-year-old from Long Island named Rosalind Walter, who had taken a job riveting Corsair fighter planes at a Connecticut aircraft plant after high school because her country needed her to. The song painted a picture. Rosie works hard. Rosie is patriotic. Rosie has a boyfriend in the Marines. And Rosie, crucially, is still thoroughly recognizably feminine. She is not threatening. She is not radical. She is in the careful language of wartime marketing doing her part. But here is where it gets complicated and interesting and worth pausing over. Because the image that most of us know today, that woman in the blue denim coveralls, red bandana flexing her arm saying, "We can do it," that particular poster was not at the time a mass campaign piece at all. It was painted by an artist named J. Howard Miller for the internal use of the Westinghouse Electric Company. It hung on their factory floors for exactly 2 weeks in February of 1943, and then it was replaced by the next poster in the series. The factory workers saw it. Almost nobody else did. It sat in an archive for decades. The image we now think of as the defining symbol of wartime female empowerment was essentially a poster nobody saw during the war, which raises a question worth sitting with: how much of history is shaped by the stories we tell afterward, rather than what people actually experienced in the moment? I find that haunting in the best possible way. The image that women actually responded to at the time was Norman Rockwell's version published on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post in May of 1943. That Rosie was sturdy, muscular, wearing work clothes, holding a rivet gun on her lunch break, with her foot resting on a copy of Adolf Hitler's book Mein Kampf, strong, competent, and stepping on fascism with her work boot, if you want to motivate a country that is a fairly solid image. And the numbers show it worked. In March of 1941, just under 11 million women were employed in the United States. By August of 1944, that number had risen to 18 million. 6 to 7 million of those women had entered the workforce specifically because of the war. They came from every background imaginable: housewives in their 30s, college students, farm girls, recent immigrants, women who had never held a job outside the home in their lives. They walked into aircraft plants, shipyards, munitions factories, steel mills. More than 310,000 women worked in the American aircraft industry alone by 1943, making up 65% of the entire industry's workforce. 65%. An industry that before the war had barely employed women at all. Douglas Aircraft in Southern California employed 22,000 women building bombers. Not assembling office furniture, not filing papers, building the machines that would fly over Europe and the Pacific. And then there were the women who did not go into the factories, who answered a different call entirely. In May of 1942, Congress passed legislation creating the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. By May 16th, Avita Culp Hobby, a Texas lawyer and newspaper executive, had been sworn in as its first director. The initial goal was 25,000 women. Within a year, over 60,000 had enlisted. By the end of the war, the Women's Army Corps, as it had been renamed when it received full military status in July of 1943, had reached 150,000 members. Women who held actual military rank, actual benefits, actual dog tags. They served in clerical roles, yes, but also in communications, in intelligence, in logistics, in mechanics, in radio operations. About 200 of them served in General Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters in North Africa, described by the Army's own historians as one of the most highly qualified groups ever to reach the field, hand-picked, all volunteer, almost all of them linguists as well as qualified specialists. Linguists, specialists, volunteers, not women waiting to be told what they could handle, women who already knew. And then there were the pilots, the Women Air Force Service pilots, The Wasps were not the army. They were not quite anything the United States had ever had before. More than 1,000 women who flew military aircraft ferrying planes from factories to bases testing new aircraft, fresh off the assembly line before male pilots flew them in combat, accumulating over 60 million miles of flight distance during the war years. Think about that number. 60 million miles. Not recreational flights, not demonstration flights. Operational, functional, necessary flights in aircraft that were not always reliably airworthy on routes that were not always safely predictable. 38 of them died during the war. And because of their ambiguous civilian status, those 38 women received no military honours. Their families paid to ship their bodies home. It would take another 33 years until 1977 before the Women Air Force Service pilots were finally recognised as military veterans of World War II. 33 years. I want you to sit with that for just a moment because I think it matters enormously to the story we're telling tonight. These were women who flew military aircraft who died in military service and whom their own government chose not to acknowledge for 33 years because their contribution did not fit the official story of who had won the war. That erasure was not accidental, and the women who lived long enough to fight for recognition knew it. But let us come back to the women on the ground. The ones in the factories, the shipyards, the offices, the ones who are not flying anyone anywhere, just showing up at a plant in Ohio at 6 a.m, tying their hair back, learning to operate machinery they had never touched before and doing it. What was that actually like? Here is something the posters did not show you. It was loud. Factory floors in the 1940s were extraordinarily loud, the kind of sustained noise that you felt in your chest, not just your ears. Women learned to communicate in a kind of improvised sign language above the roar of the machinery. They learned to read lips. They developed shortcuts and shorthand and a whole vocabulary that existed only on the floor of their particular plant, specific to the work, specific to the people doing it. It was physically demanding in ways most of these women had simply never encountered. Holding a rivet gun for 8 hours, welding in positions that required you to contort yourself into spaces that, frankly, the designers of those machines had not necessarily imagined a human body inhabiting. Women developed blisters, muscle cramps, repetitive strain injuries, things that took weeks to develop, and then quietly the body adapted. A 19-year-old woman named Betty Jean Boggs, who worked in a plant making aircraft at the age of 17, described it this way when she was interviewed years later. "I worked on a war plant, and it was one of the things you did when your country was at war, and it had been an enjoyable experience. Even today I'm very proud of that job. I can always say, hey, I was a riveter during World War II. The pride in that voice even decades later. Even after everything that came afterward, even after being told repeatedly and institutionally that it was not really her war, not really her achievement. Still, hey, I was a riveter. And the paycheck. This is the part that tends to get left out of the poster and patriotism version of the story. Women doing war work were still paid less than their male counterparts. In most industries, female workers earned somewhere around 50% of male wages, a gap that was not hidden or apologized for, simply presented as a structural feature of the economy, as natural as the weather. But, and this is the thing, 50% of a factory wage in 1943 was still for many of these women more money than they had ever held in their own hands. For a woman who had spent the last several years managing a household budget that technically belonged to her husband, receiving a weekly paycheck with her own name on it was not a small thing. It was a first. And firsts have a way of remaking the people who experience them. Think about what that actually means practically. A checking account in her own name. The ability to walk into a store and make a purchase without asking anyone's permission or explaining where the money was going. The ability to decide on her own what to do with what she earned. These sound modest now. They were not modest then. They were for many women the first concrete experience of what financial independence felt like in the body, not as an abstract idea, not as a political argument, but as a physical, material, daily reality. And the difficulty, the real profound difficulty, was that once you had felt that you could not unfeel it, you could be told to give it up. You could be pressured, shamed, legislated against. But the memory of it lived in you, the knowledge of what was possible. That knowledge quietly accumulated in the hands and the bank accounts of millions of American women between 1942 and 1945 was one of the most subversive things that ever happened in this country. And the government that had created it would spend the next decade and a half trying very hard to put it back in the bottle. There is one more thing I want to leave you with before we move forward in this story. Something I keep coming back to. The recruitment campaign, the posters, the songs, the Office of War Information reports, they did something interesting in their language. They framed women's war work not as a permanent expansion of opportunity, but as a temporary loan. For the duration was the phrase. Women were needed for the duration of the war. The implication was plain: this is borrowed time. This is not yours to keep. And yet, the women who showed up, all 6 million of them, did not experience it as borrowed time. They experienced it as their actual lives, their actual hands on an actual machine, their actual name on an actual paycheck, their actual expertise built up over months and years in jobs they were good at, often quietly, privately better at than they had expected to be. Borrowed time has a way of becoming something else. When you live inside it long enough, it starts to feel like yours. What happens when someone tries to take back what a woman has already decided belongs to her? That is exactly where we are going next. Inside the factory walls. What those 4 years actually made, and what no government recruitment poster ever quite predicted. 6 in the morning. The alarm goes off, or maybe it has not even gone off yet because she's been awake for the past 20 minutes staring at the ceiling in the grey, pre-dawn dark, her mind already running ahead of the day. She dresses quickly, not in a house dress, not in anything soft or domestic. She pulls on slacks, which in 1942 was still an act that could make her mother wince, ties her hair back under a bandana, and steps out the door into a world that smells like early morning fog and engine oil. She's headed to the factory, and the extraordinary thing, the thing I keep returning to, is that she is not dreading it. She is not dragging her feet. Something else is pulling her forward, something she does not yet have the language to name, but will spend the rest of her life trying to describe to anyone who was not there to feel it. Usefulness. Real, verifiable, undeniable usefulness. The kind that leaves a mark on the physical world long after the shift ends. Let us talk about what that world actually looked like. Because the factory floor of a wartime American plant was nothing like what the recruitment posters suggested. The posters showed clean, bright women at neat workbenches, cheerful, unflustered, hair perfectly arranged beneath their bandanas. The reality was something else entirely. The reality was noise that hit you like a wall the moment you walked through the door, a sustained bone-deep roar of machinery running at full capacity around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in facilities that had been built or converted with speed rather than comfort in mind. Most plants ran 3 shifts. The floor never cooled down. The air smelled of metal shavings, cutting oil, and the sweat of several hundred people, working in close quarters for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours at a stretch. Women who spent those years on the factory floor described communicating in a kind of improvised sign language, learning to read lips, to tap shoulders, to pass information through a shorthand that existed only in their particular plant, among their particular crew, and that dissolved like smoke the day the factory closed. That is a kind of knowledge that never makes it into history books. The small specific vocabularies of working women. And the work itself, let us be precise about this, because it matters to understanding what happened to these women. They were not doing symbolic work. They were not assembling something decorative while men did the real labour nearby. A 20-year-old woman named Margarita Pauletto, working at Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego in 1943, became the first woman in her department to operate a drop hammer, a piece of heavy industrial equipment used to stamp out metal parts. The company newspaper celebrated her by name. The praise sat alongside a note about her hobbies at home, as if the editors felt obligated to reassure readers that this woman operating heavy machinery was still fundamentally domestic. But notice what happened there. She was the first. In a department that presumably assumed no woman could or would do that job, a 20-year-old from Escondido walked in, learned the machine, and did it. And the women at Douglas Aircraft in Southern California were not assembling anything small or delicate. They were building bombers, B-17, B-24, machines the size of houses powered by engines louder than anything most of these women had ever stood next to in their lives. Each plane took thousands of hours of labour. Each rivet, every weld, every precisely cut piece of aluminum had to be exactly right, because the alternative was a plane that came apart in the sky, with a crew of 10 inside it. There was no margin for carelessness in that work, and the women knew it, and that knowledge that the stakes were real, that the quality of their hands mattered in a life or death way, did something to them. It gave their work a weight that no amount of domestic management had ever quite provided. Not because domestic work is unimportant, but because nobody had ever told them in quite such explicit and material terms that what they did with their hands might save a man's life. Here is a question I want to pause on for a moment because I think it gets at something essential. Have you ever been given a job that surprised you? A task you walked into assuming would be beyond you, and then discovered that you were in fact entirely capable? That the limitation was never really yours, it was the world's expectation of you. That is what the factory did for millions of women in the compressed span of a few months. The historian Emily Yellin, who spent years interviewing women who had worked the wartime industrial jobs, wrote that the women she spoke with without exception described a version of the same experience. The moment they discovered they could do the job, not theoretically, not with conditions attached, just yes, I can do this. And then what else have I been capable of all along? That second question is the dangerous one. That is the question that does not go back in the box. But I want to spend some time on something the histories often skip over, which is everything that happened around the work itself. Because the transformation was not only about the labour, it was about the entire texture of the life that labour created. Take housing. In cities where war industries were concentrated, Richmond, California, Baltimore, Detroit, Beaumont, Texas, Seattle, Portland, Charleston, South Carolina. The influx of workers arrived faster than existing housing could absorb them. Women who had come from small towns in the Midwest or the South to take a factory job found themselves sometimes sleeping in cars, living in tents, sharing a single room with 3 or 4 other women. Chronic housing shortages drove women who had never lived alone, never in many cases spent more than a few nights away from their parents or their husbands, into entirely new configurations of domestic life. They became roommates. They made friends out of strangers. They built in the cramped improvised quarters of wartime boom towns, something that looked a great deal like the life a college woman might have had, if most of these women had been allowed to go to college in the first place. The camaraderie that developed on those factory floors and in those overcrowded dormitories and boarding houses was, by almost every account from women who lived it, one of the most significant things they carried out of the war years. Not the planes they built, not the wages they earned, but the friendships. Women who had spent their adult lives in the socially isolated geography of single-family homes, where your social world was bounded by your husband's professional contacts, and whoever happened to live on your block suddenly found themselves embedded in a dense network of women who were all simultaneously figuring out the same things. How to do a job they had never done before. how to manage a household without a man in it, how to be tired in a way that was different from domestic tiredness, not the diffuse invisible exhaustion of endless small tasks, but the sharp, specific fatigue of having pushed your body to a precise physical limit and made something real at the end of it. There is a different kind of pride in that fatigue. Anyone who has ever finished something genuinely hard knows exactly what I mean. And the double burden. This is the part that tends to get left out of the more romanticized versions of the story. Many of these women, more than people tend to remember, were not single. They were married. Some had children. The largest shipyards on the West Coast estimated that as many as half of their female workforce had children at home. Half! Which means these women were not simply trading homemaking for factory work. They were doing both. They worked 6 days a week in some plants. They came home from an 8 or 10 hour shift and then cooked, cleaned managed ration books, grew vegetables in the Victory garden out back, wrote letters to husbands overseas, helped children with schoolwork and fell into bed at some dark hour of the night only to start again the next morning. And the childcare situation in 1942 was, to put it plainly, a disaster. Nationally, only about 10% of working mothers had access to any kind of professional childcare. 10%. Some plants ran childcare centers. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, were genuinely innovative in this regard, operating round-the-clock child development centers staffed by trained professionals, one of the first times industrial employers had acknowledged that their workers were also parents. But Kaiser was the exception, not the rule. Most women solved the childcare problem the way women have always solved it before and since, through networks of neighbors and family, through older children looking after younger ones, through arrangements stitched together out of mutual necessity that had no official name and left no record in any archive. Invisible labor on top of invisible labor. And yet, and this is the thing that moves me most about this period, even the women who were carrying the heaviest loads, the ones doing war work and motherhood and domestic management on 4 hours of sleep and rationed coffee, even they describe those years as ones in which they felt more fully alive than at any other point in their lives, more competent, more connected, more like themselves. How do you explain that? I think the honest answer is that capability, when you discover it, changes the fundamental way you move through the world. And once you know what you are capable of, once that knowledge has lodged itself not in your head, but in the muscles of your forearms, in the pride of a finished shift, in the weight of a paycheck that is entirely yours, that knowledge does not leave just because the war ends. There is a woman I keep thinking about. Her name was Juanita Allen, and she worked at a shipyard in the Pacific Northwest during the war years. Decades later, an interviewer asked her what it had been like. She said something that stopped me completely when I first read it. She said we were becoming different people. We just didn't know it yet. We were becoming different people. We just didn't know it yet. That sentence contains the entire history of what the factory walls did to the women who worked inside them. Not a sudden dramatic transformation. Not a moment of revelation. Just a slow, daily, almost invisible accumulation of evidence that the woman the world had told her she was a much smaller version of the woman she actually turned out to be. You spend 4 years discovering the distance between those two things, and something in you permanently calibrates to the larger version. You cannot go back to the smaller one, even if you wanted to, even if the entire world is about to spend a great deal of effort insisting that you should. Outside the factory, the world was moving in its own parallel tracks. 20 commodities were rationed during the war years: rubber, gasoline, sugar, meat, butter, coffee. The famous instruction, use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without, was not a slogan. It was the operating principle of daily life. By 1944, 21 million American families had planted victory gardens on whatever land they could access: backyards, vacant lots, public parks, window boxes, and those gardens produced roughly 40% of the country's vegetables that year. 40% of a nation's vegetable supply grown by ordinary people in their spare time because there was no other way to feed everyone. Women ran those gardens. Women organized the rationing networks. Women managed the complex logistics of feeding a household with a shrinking budget and an increasingly limited set of ingredients. And they were doing all of this while also working in the factory, while writing letters to husbands at the front, while listening to the radio at night for news that might tell them whether those husbands were still alive. I want to say that again plainly. There were women in this country during the years between 1942 and 1945 who were building military aircraft during the day, growing their own food in the evening, putting children to bed and going to sleep not knowing whether the person they had married would ever come home. And they got up the next morning and did it again. That is not resilience as an abstraction. That is resilience as a daily material practice repeated until it became simply who they were. And here is the quiet revolution happening underneath all of it. One that nobody planned. One that no government report tracked. One that no wartime poster was designed to create. In fact, one that the posters were specifically designed to prevent. The women were changing their minds about themselves. Not all at once, not loudly, not in the form of protests or declarations, but in the small private accumulating recognitions of daily life. The woman who learned she could read a blueprint. The one who discovered she could weld a seam that passed inspection. The one who figured out over the course of a 12-hour shift that her hands were steadier than she had ever been told to expect. These were not philosophical awakenings. They were practical ones. They happened in the gap between what women had been told about themselves and what the work proved empirically to be true. And that gap, once you have felt it, is very hard to unsee. The factory walls held a world of noise and exhaustion and friendship and competence and the daily bone-deep satisfaction of work that mattered. And when those walls eventually went quiet, when the orders slowed, and the men came home and the world began asking these women to walk back out and return to the lives they had lived before, a very significant number of them paused. And in that pause, a pause that lasted for some only a moment and for others an entire lifetime, they asked themselves the question that no government, no employer, no social pressure campaign, no magazine, no movie, no well-meaning neighbour had ever quite anticipated. Why? Why should I go back and back to what exactly? Because the woman who walked through that factory door in 1942 and the woman standing on the other side of it in 1945, they are not the same person. What happens when a war ends and a woman who's been changed by it has to decide what to do with herself next? That is the heart of the story, and we are getting there. November 1942. Somewhere in the Pyrenees Mountains on the border between France and Spain, a woman is walking through the snow. She's been walking for 2 days. The trail rises to 7,500 feet before it descends into Spain, 50 miles of mountain terrain in November, in weather that any sensible person would wait out somewhere dry and warm. She is not waiting. She cannot wait. The Gestapo is behind her. Klaus Barbie, the man history would later call the Butcher of Lyon, has her description plastered on wanted posters across occupied France. The words above her portrait read, "The enemy's most dangerous spy. We must find and destroy her." And the thing making every step across that snow-covered mountain a particular kind of painful is a 7-pound wooden prosthetic strapped to the stump of her left leg. Her name is Virginia Hall. She's 36 years old. She's from Baltimore, Maryland. And before the war, what she'd wanted more than almost anything was a quiet desk job at the American State Department. They had told her no, repeatedly and officially. The State Department did not hire women into diplomatic roles, so she had found another door, and she'd walked through it so thoroughly that the most feared secret police force in the world was currently hunting her through the mountains of southern France. Let us stay with Virginia for a moment, because her story is one of those that you could spend an entire evening on and still feel like you'd only touched the surface. She had lost her left leg below the knee in a hunting accident years before the war. The amputation had been clean, but the aftermath was not. She had applied 17 times 17 to join the Foreign Service. Rejected, repeatedly, because of the leg. The official position of the United States government was that an amputee could not perform diplomatic duties adequately. What the government did not account for was Virginia Hall's particular temperament, which was in a word undeterrable. When the war broke out in Europe, she made her way to England and volunteered with the British Special Operations Executive, the organisation Winston Churchill had described famously as created to set Europe ablaze. In 1941, Virginia Hall became the first female resident agent the SOE had ever deployed to France. She arrived in Lyon with forged papers identifying her as an American journalist. She immediately proved so effective at recruiting resistance networks, running safe houses, sheltering downed Allied pilots and escaped prisoners, and feeding intelligence back to London, that within months she had built a spy network of over 90 agents across southern France, coordinating their communications through coded messages buried inside Western Union telegrams, sent to a contact at the New York Post. The Gestapo flooded Lyon with 500 additional agents trying to find her. She kept working. She could be 4 different women in the space of a single afternoon, said one historian who interviewed people who knew her during this period. 4 identities, 4 code names, same afternoon. And then in November of 1942, the Germans moved to fully occupy Vichy, France, and Virginia Hall had approximately 12 hours to become someone else or be captured. She fled by train to the south and then on foot, the 7-pound prosthetic, the mountain, the snow, the Gestapo somewhere behind her. And she radioed ahead to London to say she was attempting the crossing, but that she was concerned about Cuthbert. Cuthbert was her private name for her artificial leg. London, not knowing this, radioed back with calm efficiency, "If Cuthbert is giving you difficulty, have him eliminated." She survived. She made it to Spain, was briefly arrested by Spanish authorities for illegal border crossing, was eventually released, and made her way back to London. And then, and this is the part that tells you everything about who she was, she asked to go back. The British said no. She was too well known now, too compromised, too dangerous. So she joined the Americans. In March of 1944, under the code name Diane Virginia Hall returned to France for her second tour. A London makeup artist had taught her to draw convincing wrinkles on her face. A London dentist, a rather alarming one by all accounts, had ground down her white American teeth to match the worn enamel of a French peasant woman. She moved through the Haute-Loire region disguised as an elderly milkmaid camping in barns and attics, moving every few days to stay ahead of the radio detection units that were methodically scanning the countryside for illegal transmissions. By the time the Allied invasion came on June 6, 1944, Hall's network had grown to 1,500 resistance fighters she had personally arm-trained and coordinated. Her teams destroyed 4 bridges, derailed freight trains, severed rail lines, and cut communications networks in the weeks before and after the Normandy landings. After the war, General William Donovan presented her with the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest military honours for bravery in combat. She was the only civilian woman to receive it in World War II. Her mother was the only person present at the ceremony. Virginia Hall had requested that no publicity be made of it. She had survived the war, and that was enough. I want you to pause here for a moment and think about what Virginia Hall's story tells us, not just about her, but about the shape of opportunity in that era. She wanted a desk job, a respectable, stable, ordinary desk job at the State Department, and the government said no 17 times because of her leg. The irony being, of course, that the leg they considered disqualifying was the same leg she dragged through 50 miles of mountain snow to escape the most feared secret police force in Europe. The limitation was never the leg. It was the imagination of the people doing the hiring, and that is a story that belongs not just to Virginia Hall, it belongs to every woman in this entire period who was told she was not suited for something and then spent the next 4 years doing exactly that thing and doing it well, and in some cases doing it better than the people who had turned her away. But Virginia Hall's story, extraordinary as it is, represents the far edge of what women did during the war. For every Virginia Hall operating behind enemy lines with forged teeth and a fake identity, there were 60,000 women in the Army Nurse Corps doing work that was less cinematic perhaps, but no less dangerous and no less defining. Think about what nursing in a wartime field hospital actually meant. The first American nurses to arrive in Normandy landed on the beachhead 4 days after the initial invasion in June of 1944. 4 days. The fighting was still very much ongoing. These were not women watching from a distance, they were 4 days behind the front line of one of the largest military operations in the history of warfare. A nurse named Marian Elcano, who served with the 45th Field Hospital, described in an interview years later that she had no idea when she signed her papers that within a single year she would be following an advancing army across France into Germany, tearing down and rebuilding a 400-bed tent hospital every time the front line moved, sometimes moving in the middle of the night with all lights extinguished to avoid being spotted from the air. 400 beds packed up and reassembled in the dark, and the patients filling those beds were not people with minor injuries. They were men who had come directly from combat, arriving by the truckload in the hours after major engagements, burn shrapnel wounds, fractures, the particular compound injuries that high-velocity weapons create at close range. The statistics from this period are genuinely striking. Fewer than 4% of American soldiers who received medical care in the field died from their wounds or disease. 4%. That number did not happen by accident. It happened because 60,000 nurses were there. And then there were the Angels of Bataan. This is a story that deserves far more attention than it receives. In the Philippines in December of 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor, American forces were already under attack. Most personnel were evacuated. Most. But 88 American nurses stayed. Either could not get out in time or chose not to leave their patients. All 88. By the time the Japanese army completed its occupation of the Philippines in early 1942, those nurses were no longer in hospital buildings. They were in the jungles of Bataan, operating 2 open-air field hospitals simultaneously caring for 2,900 patients, while themselves contracting malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever from the same environment as the wounded men they were treating. They performed surgeries in conditions that would have been considered impossible in peacetime. They improvised, they adapted, they rationed medications that were running out with no resupply coming. And when the Japanese advance made even the jungle hospitals untenable, they were captured. 99 women became prisoners of war. They were held for 3 years. 3 years as prisoners of war, continuing to care for sick and wounded patients in captivity, under conditions that deteriorated steadily as the war progressed. And when they were finally liberated in February of 1945, thin ill having survived on drastically reduced rations for years, one of the first things several of them reportedly said was that they were glad they had not left their patients, glad they had stayed, even knowing what the 3 years had cost them. I have read that detail several times and it still stops me completely, because it says something about what it means to commit yourself to work that is genuinely about someone other than yourself, and how that kind of commitment can hold a person together through things that would otherwise destroy them. There is a question I find myself turning over as I sit with all of these stories. We tend, when we think about World War II, to frame women's service as something that happened in reaction to male absence. The men left, the women filled in. When the men came back, the women stepped aside. A temporary adjustment, a wartime necessity, but that framing misses something essential. Because the women who served, whether in the factories, in the military hospitals, in the intelligence networks of occupied France, or in the jungle operating theatres of the Pacific, were not merely filling a space that men had vacated. They were creating a body of experience, personal, physical, irreversible experience, the kind that does not come undone when circumstances change. Virginia Hall never stopped working in intelligence after the war. She moved directly into the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency and remained there until mandatory retirement at 60. She'd spent the entirety of her adult life doing work that most people, including most women of her generation, had been told was simply not available to them, and she knew that. More than perhaps anyone, she knew the gap between what women were told they could do and what they were actually capable of doing. She spent decades after the war in an organization that still, according to historians who have studied this period, treated her with less authority and fewer opportunities than her record warranted. Because she was a woman. Because the war was over. Because the exceptional circumstances that had allowed her to become the most feared Allied spy in France had been replaced by peacetime structures that were once again comfortable and familiar in their limitations. She left no memoir. She gave no interviews. When she retired, much of her work remained classified for decades. The full scope of what she had done was not publicly acknowledged for years after her death in 1982, and I keep thinking about that. The silence of extraordinary women, not because they had nothing to say, but because the world they returned to after the war was not particularly interested in listening. Do you ever wonder about the people who came before you? The ones whose lives made certain things possible that you now simply take for granted. The women in this story are those people, not the ones on the posters, not the iconic image in the red bandana, but the ones whose names never appeared on a poster at all. The nurses who kept surgeries running in a jungle, the spies who crossed mountains in November, the pilots who flew military aircraft without anyone offering them a parade afterward. They did not set out to change history. Most of them would have been surprised to hear anyone describe it that way. They set out to do a job that needed doing. They discovered in the process of doing it something about themselves that had always been there waiting patient and largely unused, and that discovery quiet, personal, happening in the middle of the most violent period the modern world had ever produced. That discovery had consequences. Not immediate ones, not the kind that make headlines or get written into laws, but the slow, cumulative kind. The kind that lives inside a woman who returns from a field hospital in France, or from a jungle in the Philippines, or from a factory floor in Ohio and sits with her family at the dinner table, and knows in a way she cannot quite put into words and would not have been thanked for saying aloud that she is not the same person she was before she left. And whatever comes next, the homecoming, the expectations, the pressure to return to who she was, she is carrying something that cannot be taken back, something she earned. In the next part of this story, we're going to sit with the quiet interior of those war years, the loneliness nobody talked about. The cost of doing all of this while the person you loved most in the world was somewhere on the other side of an ocean, and letters took weeks to arrive and some of them never did. That part of the story is smaller in some ways, less dramatic. But I think for many of the women listening to this tonight, it might be the part that lands closest to home. Nobody ever put it in the recruitment posters. There was no image for it, no iconic illustration, no catchy slogan, no government-approved visual language for the particular kind of waiting that became the daily interior weather of millions of American women between 1942 and 1945. The factories had their posters, the war bonds had their posters, even grief had its symbol, the gold star hung in the window replacing the blue star that had been there before, quiet and devastating in its simplicity. But the waiting itself, the sustained, corrosive, shapeless waiting that defined the emotional life of women on the home front that had no image, because it was not dramatic enough for a poster. It just went on and on and on, through ordinary days, through factory shifts and ration books and children's bedtimes, through the sound of the radio in the evenings, and the particular silence of a house where someone important used to be. Let me tell you about a sound. In American neighborhoods during the war years, there was one sound that stopped people in their tracks like nothing else could. Not an air raid siren, those were exercises mostly in continental America. Not a plane overhead. A bicycle. Specifically, the sound of a bicycle slowing down on a residential street. Because in most towns and cities, the Western Union Telegraph Company employed young men on bicycles to deliver the telegrams from the War Department. The ones that started with the words, "I regret to inform you." One man who grew up in such a neighborhood during the war described it this way years later. Every person on the block knew the routine. You heard the bicycle slowing. You watched without meaning to. You followed with your eyes as it moved up the street past the house with the blue star in the window past the next one, and you held your breath until it stopped or did not. If it passed your house, you exhaled, and then you watched which of your neighbors was going to have her life divided permanently into before and after. That is what waiting looked like from the outside. From the inside, it was something else entirely. In the summer of 1944, a woman named Polly Crow wrote a letter to her husband William, who was overseas. She had taken a job at a boat and machine company in Indiana while he was away. She had opened her own checking account, and in the letter she told him cheerfully, proudly, with obvious delight, that she was now officially his little shipyard babe. She described the particular satisfaction of writing a check with her own name on it, of not having to ask anyone's permission for anything. But what the letter also carries, if you read it carefully, reading between the sentences, is the shape of someone who has rebuilt her life around an absence, who has made herself busy and competent and proud, because the alternative is to sit still with how much she misses him, and how frightened she is, and how the fear never entirely lifts even on the good days. The cheerfulness in wartime letters is not dishonesty, but it is almost always, at least in part, armor. Researchers who have studied the correspondence of this period, and there are enormous archives of it, hundreds of thousands of letters, note that women's letters home almost universally maintained a tone of buoyancy and determination. "You're doing well. The children are fine. I am managing." Sometimes funny, often tender, occasionally raw, but almost never fully despairing, because they knew the letters would be read by a man who was sleeping in a tent somewhere, or on a ship or in a hospital, and the last thing he needed was to carry her fear on top of his own. So she held it. She folded it up and kept it somewhere inside and wrote the cheerful letter instead. And the folded-up fear accumulated quietly over months and years in a place she did not always have words for. There is particular cruelty in the logistics of wartime communication that I do not think gets enough attention. A letter sent from the United States to a serviceman in the Pacific could take weeks to arrive, sometimes longer depending on the intensity of operations, the unpredictability of transport, the ever-present possibility that the ship or plane carrying the mail did not make it through. By the time your words reached him, the world you were describing when you wrote them was already 3 weeks out of date. And his reply, whenever it came, described a world that was already a month behind by the time you read it. You were always talking to each other across a gap in time, never quite in the same moment. The American military introduced V-mail in 1942 to try to speed things up. Letters, photographed, reduced to microfilm, shipped in bulk, and reprinted on the other end. Between June of 1942 and November of 1945, more than 1 billion V-mails were processed by the postal system. 1 billion! But V-mail was constrained to a single standardized page. It was efficient and impersonal, and most frustratingly, you could not include any enclosures. No pressed flowers, no photographs, no lipstick kiss on the envelope. Those small human gestures that kept people feeling real to each other across impossible distances, V-mail's machinery could not accommodate them, so women still wrote the long letters by hand. And they waited weeks for responses that arrived out of sequence, referring to events that had already resolved themselves one way or another by the time the envelope finally appeared. It was like having a conversation where you could only hear the other person's voice every few weeks in fragments in the wrong order. How do you maintain intimacy across that kind of distance? How do you keep knowing someone when the knowing keeps arriving late? That is a question I do not think anyone fully solved. And the consequences of it, the distance that grew in the gap between letters, showed up powerfully when the men came home. But we will get to that. For now, let us stay with the women who were waiting, because the loneliness of this period had a quality that was different from ordinary loneliness, different from the loneliness of a bad week or an empty house or a friendship that has drifted. It was lonely in the way that sustained uncertainty is lonely. Not knowing, that was the particular texture of it. Not knowing on any given morning whether the person you'd married was still alive. Not knowing why a letter had not arrived in 3 weeks, whether it was the mail system or the military censors or something else, something unthinkable, the thing you did not let yourself think about until the quiet hours of the night when the children were finally asleep and there was nothing left to keep your mind occupied. One woman interviewed decades later for an oral history project described a ritual she had developed during the war years. Every morning before the children were up, she would stand at the window with her coffee and look at the street. Not for anything in particular, just looking, just checking. She was checking whether the bicycle had come. She did this for 3 years, every morning, and she never talked about it. Not to her neighbours, not to her mother, not to her friends, because everyone around her was doing their own version of the same thing. They had what she called a collective silent agreement. You did not say the fear out loud. You just carried it, together, alone. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever carried a fear so long that it became less like a feeling and more like a climate? Something you stopped noticing because it was just always there, the background weather of your days. That is what 3 years of not knowing does. It trains you to function inside uncertainty, as if uncertainty was simply the normal condition of existence. And the strange thing is it was. For millions of women during those years it genuinely was. The statistics of loss were enormous. More than 400,000 Americans died during the war. Behind each of those numbers was a family. A wife who had been waiting, a mother who had watched the street, a child who would grow up without a father, and the Gold Star mothers, the women who hung the Gold Star in the window to replace the blue, became their own quiet community. In towns across the country they met weekly, for lunch, for support for the company of people who did not need you to explain the weight of what you were carrying, because nobody else quite understood it. Even the women whose husbands came home understood it in a different way than the ones who lost theirs. Grief in wartime is not simple. It is layered with pride and guilt and relief and longing in proportions that shift from hour to hour. And it happens inside a public narrative that tells you to be proud, to be brave, to be grateful. There is not always room inside that narrative for the messier private truth. And yet there was another dimension to all of this one that is harder to talk about because it sits closer to the bone. The loneliness of the war years did something else to women that has never quite made it into the official story. It made some of them quietly bloom. Not all of them. Not even most. But enough that historians who have spent time in the letters and diaries of this period recognize it as a pattern. A woman named Edith Speart, writing to her husband Victor in October of 1945, just after the war had ended, just as he was preparing to come home, put it more directly than almost anyone. "I am not exactly the same girl you left," she told him. "I am twice as independent as I used to be." And then a month later she added, "I get emotional satisfaction out of working, and I don't doubt that many a night you will cook supper while I am at a meeting." Read that again for a moment. A woman in 1945 telling her husband in a letter that he should expect to cook dinner on the night she's at meetings. This is not the woman who waved from the doorstep in 1942. Something has happened to her in the years between. Not something dramatic, no single moment of revelation. Just the slow accumulation of evidence that she is more than she was told she was, and she has decided quietly but firmly that she is not going to pretend otherwise. The loneliness of those years was real. I do not want to romanticize it, the fear, the uncertainty, the women who lost husbands they never stopped missing. None of that was small. None of it should be dressed up as simply growth. But coexisting with all of that, running alongside it like a parallel current, was something that the women themselves often struggled to name, a kind of aliveness, the aliveness of being fully responsible for yourself, of carrying your own weight, making your own decisions, going to bed at the end of a day that was entirely yours. One researcher described it as the discovery for many women of their own interior landscape. Before the war, the domestic world was busy enough, full of other people's needs, other people's schedules, the constant management of a household built around someone else's life. The war stripped that away. The house was still there, the children were still there, but the centre of gravity had shifted. For 3 years, the centre of gravity was her, and that shift, quiet, unremarked, not visible in any official record, was arguably the most consequential thing that happened to American women during the entire war. More consequential in some ways than the factories, more consequential even than the paychecks. Because you can take away a factory job, you can close a woman's checking account, you can tell her firmly and repeatedly to go home, but you cannot reach inside a person and reverse the 3 years during which she learned that she was someone worth centering. That knowledge lives in the body, it does not leave. And it was that knowledge folded quietly into the luggage of millions of women as they prepared, or were forced or were pressured to welcome the men back home. That was going to make the 1950s a great deal more complicated than anybody in 1945 was quite ready to admit. The war ended. The celebrations were real and enormous and deeply felt, and underneath them, underneath the ticker tape and the Times Square photographs and the couples kissing in the street, a question was forming, one that would not be answered for a generation. What happens next? May 8th, 1945. Somewhere in London, 2 women climbed into the fountains of Trafalgar Square and grinned at a camera soaking wet, entirely unbothered, with the kind of joy that does not care what it looks like. In New York, sailors shinned up lampposts in Times Square. In Paris, crowds surged down the Champs-Élysées, men and women streaming past the Arc de Triomphe, waving Allied flags until their arms ached. In Berlin, the guns had gone quiet. In London, Buckingham Palace was lit for the first time since 1939, floodlights blazing against a sky that for nearly 6 years had been something to hide from. And in 1,000 American towns, in the shipyards of Richmond, California, in the aircraft plants of Dayton, Ohio, in the munitions factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, and Baltimore, women who had been on the morning shift stopped their machines and heard the news, and some of them wept, and some of them laughed, and some of them stood very still for a moment that is difficult to describe. Because joy and dread, it turns out, can occupy the same body at the same time, and many of them, though they could not have put it into words in that moment, felt both. The relief was real. Do not misunderstand me. The relief was enormous, physical, the kind that makes your legs go slightly weak. The men were coming home. The telegrams from the War Department would stop. The bicycle on the street would just be a bicycle again. More than 400,000 American families had already received the worst news, but for the millions more who'd been waiting and holding their breath for years, May 8th, and then September 2nd, when Japan formally surrendered those dates, meant that the waiting was over. Whatever came next, at least it was not this. At least the not knowing had an answer now. That relief was not small, I want to be clear about that. But sitting inside it for a significant number of women, not all, not even most, but enough to matter, was something else. A question that arrived quietly, almost apologetically alongside the celebrations. What happens to me now? The answer, as it turned out, came fairly quickly and was not particularly gentle. In the first month after Japan's surrender in September of 1945, 2.5 million American workers were laid off or dismissed. 2.5 million in a single month. And the dismissals were not random. They followed a pattern that the numbers make very clear. Between June and September of 1945, just those 3 months, just as the war was ending, 1 in 4 women who had held factory jobs lost them. 1 in 4. In the automobile industry, women had held 25% of all jobs during the war. By April of 1946, less than a year later, they held 7.5%. The aircraft industry, which had employed women at 65% of its workforce at the height of wartime production, shed them at a rate that mirrors almost exactly the rate at which returning veterans walked back through the factory door. The math is not subtle. The women were not leaving. They were being replaced. At a Ford Motor Company plant in Michigan, and I find this story particularly worth sitting with, women workers publicly protested when the company moved to dismiss them in favour of less experienced male workers who were returning from the service. Less experienced. That is the detail that matters. Not more skilled, not better qualified, just male and back from the war. Which was, in the logic of 1945, America sufficient reason to reassign the position. Several hundred women managed to keep their jobs because of the protest. Several hundred out of thousands. And the Women's Bureau at the Department of Labor, which had spent 3 years encouraging women into war work, which had published pamphlets on how to recruit them and how to keep them and how to train them, now found itself watching the same women it had recruited be systematically pushed out of the industries it had brought them into. The Bureau issued a bulletin. They argued for an equal pay bill. They documented the layoffs. It did not change the pace of them. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, the famous GI Bill, had guaranteed returning veterans priority placement in their former jobs, which was on its face entirely reasonable. These men had served their country. Of course they deserved their jobs back. But the practical consequence was that their jobs now included positions that had not previously existed. Positions that women had held for 3 or 4 years that women had learned to do, and in many cases excelled at. And those positions were now reclassified quietly and efficiently as positions that rightfully belonged to returning men. Some women understood this was coming, had understood it for some time honestly. The phrase for the duration had been in the recruitment language from the beginning. Borrowed time, they knew, but knowing something intellectually does not prepare you for the experience of it. And the experience for hundreds of thousands of women was of walking into a plant where they had worked for 3 years, where they had learned a skill, built a record, earned the respect of their supervisors, and being told with varying degrees of courtesy that their services were no longer required. Here is what I want to ask you, because I think it is worth sitting with in the quiet of this moment. Have you ever worked very hard at something, put in the hours, learned the craft, earned your place, and then had someone tell you that the place was never really yours, that you had been holding it for someone else, and now that person was back and you were done? That feeling has a specific weight to it, different from being let go for poor performance, different from a layoff in a downsizing, different even from losing a job you loved for understandable reasons. This was being told that the work you had done, the real skilled productive work, did not create a claim on anything, that your 3 years of competence were not enough to override someone else's category. A woman who had been welding bomber fuselages for 30 months was being replaced by a man who had never held a welding torch. I'm not making an argument about veterans' benefits. The GE Bill was important, and those men deserved support. I am simply noting what the women experienced, and what they experienced was the discovery that the world's need for them had been entirely conditional, that the word capable turned out to mean capable for now, in this specific emergency, in the absence of the people we actually wanted for this work. That is a particular kind of knowledge, and it does not dissolve easily. But the layoffs from war industries were only one part of the picture, because something else was happening simultaneously, something that tends to get lost in the dominant narrative of women going home and returning to domesticity. The women did not all go home. The total number of employed women in 1945 was 19 million, up from 14 million in 1940. By 1950, after 5 years of being told to leave the workforce, after the layoffs and the cultural pressure and the magazine articles that framed a woman's highest aspiration as a gleaming kitchen, the number of employed women was still over 17 million. They had lost ground in the high-paying industrial jobs. They'd been pushed out of the factory floors and the shipyards and the aircraft plants. But they had not disappeared. They had redistributed into clerical work, into service industries, into teaching and nursing, the traditional categories which suddenly had a large influx of highly competent, recently industrially trained women who were capable of doing considerably more than the jobs they were being offered. The idea that the war ended and women went home, all of them uniformly gratefully, is not exactly wrong. Some of them did. But the fuller picture is considerably messier and considerably more interesting. And the Women's Bureau surveys conducted before the war even ended, asking women in war industries what they planned to do when it was over, found something that surprised almost everyone who looked at the numbers. The majority of women said they wanted to keep working. Not all of them. Some were genuinely ready for a different pace. Some had been running factories and households simultaneously for 3 years, and wanted for a while to only run one of those things. But when the Bureau asked the women actually on the floor, the welders, the riveters, the machinists, most of them said they hoped to stay employed. That finding was quietly filed away. It did not change policy. It did not slow the dismissals, but it is there in the archives if you go looking. The women said what they wanted, and nobody particularly acted on it. There is one more thing I want to tell you about that day because it involves an image most people know and a story behind that image that almost nobody does. In Times Square on the evening of August the 14th, 1945, the night the Japanese surrender was announced, a photographer named Alfred Eisenstadt captured one of the most reproduced images in American history. A sailor in his white uniform kissing a woman in a white dress. Mid-stride, spontaneous. The photograph seemed to say everything about what the end of the war meant. The woman in the photograph, Greta Zimmer Friedman, spoke about it many years later. She was a dental assistant who'd been walking in Times Square when the announcement came. She did not know the sailor. It was not a romantic event, she said quietly and precisely. It was just someone expressing his relief and his happiness that the war was over. She was not asked. She was swept up in the moment, in the tide of it, in the physical expression of something enormous that was happening around her, whether she was participating or not. That detail does not make the photograph less beautiful as an object, but it makes it more honest as history. And it says something quietly true about the experience of women on that day in general. The war ended. The joy was real. The relief was real. The men came home and that was good. But the women were also swept up in something that was being decided around them. Something happening whether they had chosen it or not. The celebrations lasted a few days, and then the factories started calculating, and the newspapers started running articles about the importance of women returning to the home, and the veterans started coming back through the front doors of plants that women had held open for 3 years, and the women started figuring out what the next chapter looked like. For some it was genuine relief, a chance to rest, a chance to be for a while something other than the person holding everything together. For others, and this is the group whose story we're really here to tell, the end of the war was not a resolution. It was the beginning of a different problem. The man who came home was not quite the man who had left, and the woman standing at the door was not quite the woman who had waved goodbye. Two people who had loved each other, both changed, both carrying things they had not yet unpacked, both standing in the same kitchen as if the past 3 years had been a parenthesis that could simply be closed. But parentheses once opened changed the meaning of the sentence. What happened when he walked back through that door, what happened in the weeks and months after the parades ended, is exactly where we are headed next. Picture this: a front door. Any front door in any American town. The paint may be slightly faded after 3 years of neglect. Small things had gone unattended while everyone was managing larger ones. And standing on the porch step, a man in uniform, thinner than he left or heavier. Different in some way she can see even from across the yard. He's carrying a bag. He's smiling or trying to. And she is standing in the doorway. And for a fraction of a second, just a fraction, before the love rushes in and covers it, she looks at him and thinks, who is this person standing on my porch? That moment, that fraction of a second, that is what we are going to talk about. Operation Magic Carpet. The largest military demobilization in American history brought home more than 8 million American servicemen in the 12 months following Japan's surrender. 8 million. Ships arriving in East Coast ports, West Coast ports, Gulf ports. Trains fanning out across the country in every direction. Men stepping onto platforms in small towns in Iowa and Georgia and Colorado searching for faces they had been thinking about for years. And then the drive home, or the walk, and then the door. For some couples it was everything the reunion was supposed to be. The love was still there, intact, warm. People found their way back to each other. Many people did, but a striking number did not. And the numbers make that very clear. In 1941, 6 American marriages ended in divorce. By 1946, the year the men had been home long enough for the initial joy to settle, and the reality of 2 changed people sharing one life to surface, the divorce rate had more than doubled. It reached 4.3 divorces per 1,000 people in 1946. More than double the rate at the start of the decade. 1 in 4 marriages was ending. It was the largest spike in divorce rates in 156 years of American data. The only spike of that magnitude in either direction, in over a century and a half of recorded American marriage history. Something had broken or was breaking in enormous numbers of households, and that something was not simple. It never is. The men who came home were carrying things nobody had a name for yet. The term we use now, post-traumatic stress disorder, did not exist in 1945. The condition did, of course. It had existed as long as humans had fought wars. But the clinical language, the formal acknowledgement, the treatment, none of that existed at scale. What existed in the military's own terminology was called combat fatigue, or battle exhaustion. Carefully chosen words, you will notice. Words that suggest temporary tiredness. Words that imply rest and time will handle it. Not words that acknowledge a fundamental rewiring of how a person experiences the world. During the war itself, nearly 1.4 million of the 16 million men who served were treated for combat fatigue. Roughly 1 in 11. And 40% of all medical discharges during the war years were for psychiatric reasons. 40%. Not wounds, not physical illness. The damage that left no mark on the skin. Those were the official documented cases, the ones severe enough to result in discharge. The actual number of men carrying significant psychological weight home with them was almost certainly much higher, because the culture of that era made it essentially impossible for most men to name what they were experiencing. You had done a hard thing. You had survived. You came home. Now you got on with it. You did not discuss what you had seen. You did not tell your wife about the things that woke you at 3 a.m. You did not admit to being afraid or broken or fundamentally altered. You got on with it. And so they got on with it. Mostly in silence. And the silence accumulated in a great many households into something that was very hard to live alongside. The historian Alan Allport, who spent years studying the post-war experience in Britain through letters, diaries, and contemporary records, described a pattern that research suggests applied broadly across the Allied nations. The soldier on the front lines had developed out of necessity a particular relationship with his own emotions. You could not function in combat if you felt everything fully. So you learned quickly and thoroughly not to feel things fully. You learned to go numb when you needed to keep moving, to focus on the next task, to process nothing until later, and then later never quite came. He came home, and his wife was there, and she wanted to know how he was really underneath. How was he? And he looked at her, and simply could not locate the access point, could not find the doorway into whatever she was asking him to enter. Not because he did not love her, but because 3 years of systematic emotional compartmentalization does not undo itself in a week, or a month, or for some men ever. Meanwhile, the woman across the table from him had spent 3 years becoming someone extraordinarily capable of functioning without him, of making decisions, solving problems, carrying everything, of being, as one woman had written plainly to her returning husband, twice as independent as she used to be. And now he was home, and some part of the old structure was supposed to reassert itself. He, the head of the household, she, the one who deferred, who waited, who asked his opinion. But she had stopped asking anyone's opinion for 3 years. She had not needed to. How do you step back into a posture that your body has forgotten? There is a particular kind of marital difficulty that does not get talked about in the official histories of this period, because it is too quiet, too domestic, too interior. It is the difficulty of two people who genuinely love each other, discovering that they have in 3 years of separation become too different to easily share a life again. Not estranged in a dramatic sense, not fallen out of love, just the life she had built in his absence did not quite have room for him in the form he had returned in. And the version of her that existed in his memory, the woman he had been thinking about for 3 years, was not quite the woman standing in front of him. Neither of them had done anything wrong. They had both simply continued to live. And living over 3 years in radically different circumstances changes a person. A psychologist writing in 1946 noted something in his case studies of returning veterans that he found striking. The men who struggled most in their marriages were often not the ones who had experienced the most severe combat. They were the ones who had grown most thoroughly into a separate self during the years away. A separate self. That phrase has stayed with me, because it applies equally to the women. They too had grown in the years of separation into separate selves, more capable, more defined, more settled into their own rhythms than the women who had waved from the platform years before. Two separate selves meeting again in the same kitchen, trying to merge back into the couple they had agreed to be before everything that had happened to both of them. Have you ever come back to a relationship after time away, after something significant happened to both of you, and found that the fit was different, not broken, not wrong, just not quite what it had been, that the two of you had been subtly reshaped by whatever had happened in between? That is what millions of couples were navigating in 1945 and 46. Except they had no language for it, no therapist trained in post-combat readjustment at any real scale, no cultural permission to say this is hard, we are struggling, we need help. The cultural expectation was a return to normal, And quickly, please, what happened in the marriages where the fit had changed is where the story gets complicated in ways that ripple forward for decades. Some men responded to the discomfort of readjustment by drinking more than they should. The rate of problem drinking among returning veterans was significant and widely noted by social workers of the time, even if it was rarely discussed in polite company. Some men grew withdrawn in ways their wives could not reach. Some became controlling in ways that were in part a response to having lived for years in environments where control meant survival. And some women, the ones who had spent 3 years learning to run everything, who had become quite certain of their own competence, were not entirely willing to relinquish what they had built. The collision of those two dynamics played out in living rooms and kitchen tables across the country in the late 1940s, in ways that were almost never visible from the outside, because you did not talk about it. That was the rule. Everything was supposed to be fine. The war was over. Your husband was home. Be grateful. And many women were grateful. Genuinely. But grateful can coexist with struggling. And struggling could not be admitted. So it went underground. Into the pauses in conversation. Into the sleep that did not come. Into the small daily negotiations of two people, trying to share a life that no longer quite fit either of them. 1946 was the year 1 in 4 American marriages ended. But here is what gets left out of that statistic: the majority of marriages did not end. Most of those couples stayed together, through the difficulty, through the strangeness, through the years of figuring out slowly and imperfectly how to be in the same room as someone you loved, who had become in some fundamental way someone new. And most of the women stayed, not because they had no choice. The economic independence the war had given them meant that more women than ever before actually had the material ability to leave if they wanted to. Some stayed because they loved their husbands and believed the difficulty was temporary. Some stayed because they had children. Some stayed because they were afraid or exhausted or had nowhere else to go. And some stayed because they had made a decision, private, conscious, deliberate, that they would work out how to be a version of themselves that the post-war world could accommodate, who kept the independence wherever they could, who ran the household and their own checking account and their own inner life, in parallel with the domestic performance that the 1950s was about to ask of them so relentlessly, who wore the apron and also made the decisions, and who eventually would raise daughters, who would do something the post-war world had not quite been ready for. But before we get there, we need to spend a little time inside the world that tried very deliberately, very persistently, to convince women that what they had been before the war was what they had always wanted to be. The magazines, the advertisements, the psychiatrist calling career-minded women lost and unlovely. The decade-long campaign to put the genie back in the bottle. That campaign was extraordinary, and it almost worked. Somewhere around 1949, something shifted in the magazines. Not all at once. Not in a single issue with a single editorial announcing the change. It was slower than that, gradual, almost imperceptible, the way a room gets darker as the afternoon fades and you do not notice, until suddenly you realize you can no longer quite make out the words on the page. In the early 1940s, the women's magazines, Ladies' Home Journal McCall's Red Book, Good Housekeeping had carried stories about independent women, women with careers, women pilots, women with their own professional opinions on science and politics and the shape of the world. The wartime version of these publications has been surprisingly modern by any measure. By the mid-1950s, those same magazines had become something else entirely. Their pages were full of nothing but housewives. Not just stories featuring housewives, stories where becoming a housewife was the resolution, the happy ending, the answer. Even the writers who had built their reputations on other things were now producing for these same magazines cheerful accounts of their children's pranks and the mystery of their washing machines, Shirley Jackson, who would go on to write some of the most unsettling literary fiction of the 20th century, contributed a piece to McCall's in April of 1956 in which she described her domestic life with the kind of bemused self-deprecation that the magazines had decided was the correct register for a woman with a mind to adopt in public. The narrowing was systematic, and it was not accidental. Let us talk about what was actually happening behind this shift, because it is more deliberate and more coordinated than most people realize. The post-war American economy needed something specific from women. Not their labor, not anymore, not in the same way. It needed their consumption. After the war, American industry pivoted from war production to the largest surge of consumer goods manufacturing the country had ever seen. Cars, refrigerators, washing machines, television sets, new houses in new suburbs built at a pace that still astonishes historians. William Levitt alone built 17,000 homes in a single development in New Jersey starting in 1947. 17,000. An entire town constructed from scratch. Then another Levittown in Pennsylvania. Then in New York. The suburbs were not a natural phenomenon, they were a product manufactured and marketed with the same efficiency that had built bombers 4 years earlier. And the engine of suburban consumption was the housewife, not the woman worker, not the woman earning, the woman shopping. The woman whose relationship to the economy was defined not by what she produced but by what she purchased. An advertising industry that had spent the war years selling women on the idea that they could do anything now pivoted with remarkable speed and agility to selling them on the idea that what they really wanted was the right dishwashing soap. I do not say this with contempt for the women involved. I say it because the advertising campaigns of this era were among the most sophisticated psychological operations ever run on a civilian population. They were self-conscious about what they were doing. The architects of post-war advertising wrote trade papers discussing openly how to redirect women's ambitions toward domestic purchasing decisions. One particularly frank analysis in an advertising trade publication of the early 1950s described the ideal female consumer as someone who should be made to feel that her domestic role was not a limitation, but an expertise, that choosing the right floor wax was a form of professional competence, that her judgment in the supermarket mattered as much as any judgment she might make in an office, which is, when you examine it clearly, an extraordinarily calculated thing to tell someone. But the advertising industry was not working alone. In 1947, two writers named Ferdinand Lundberg and Marinia Farnham published a book called Modern Woman: The Lost Sex. Farnham was a psychiatrist. Lundberg was a sociologist. The book became a national bestseller. Their argument, stripped to its core, was that women who wanted careers were psychologically disordered. Not misguided, not mistaken, disordered. Suffering in the language they borrowed from Freudian theory, from deep-seated psychological pathologies that expressed themselves as the desire to compete with men. The book described feminist thinkers as chronically neurotic. It argued that working women were damaging not only themselves, but their husbands, their children, and the social fabric. It argued that a woman's true fulfillment, her actual psychological health, could only be found in domesticity, in subordinating her ambitions to those of her family. This was not a fringe position. It was taught in universities. It was cited by psychiatrists treating patients. It shaped the advice given in popular magazines. Ruth Schwartz Cowan, writing decades later, documented how psychiatrists and popular writers of the era described women who wished to pursue careers using a vocabulary of clinical pathology. Lost, suffering from unresolved complexes, and terms far more clinical and condescending than those drawn from Freudian frameworks that had been selectively deployed, to reinforce a very specific social arrangement. Not all psychiatrists agreed, of course. Medicine has never been monolithic. But the dominant public-facing narrative, the one that appeared in newspaper columns and was cited in parenting guides and echoed on early television, was that the professionally ambitious woman was at some fundamental level a woman who needed help. Now let me ask you something. If every authority in your world, your doctor, your magazine, your neighbour, the advertisements on the radio, the television programs in the evening, if all of them were telling you consistently and from multiple angles that what you felt was not valid, that what you wanted was not natural, that your dissatisfaction was a symptom of something wrong with you rather than something wrong with the world, how long would it take before you started to believe them? That is the question that sits at the heart of the 1950s, and the statistics tell you how effective it was. By the end of the 1950s, 14 million American girls were becoming engaged by the age of 17. 14 million. The average age of marriage had dropped to 20 years old. Women attending college as a proportion of all students, which had been 47% in 1920, fell to 35% by 1958. During the mid-1950s, 60% of women who did start college dropped out before finishing their degrees, not because they failed academically, because they were afraid. And this is documented. This is what they said, that staying in school too long would make them undesirable on the marriage market. Think about what that means. Women dropping out of college because education was beginning to seem like a liability. Because the message being sent from every direction was clear: the more intellectual you are, the fewer men will want you. And the fewer men who want you, the more something must be wrong with you. The Ladies' Home Journal and McCall's had a combined readership of 36 million readers. 36 million! Month after month, those 36 million women were reading a version of their lives that told them the kitchen was the centre of everything worth having. And yet, here is the detail that complicates the tidy narrative. Even in the middle of all of this, even in the height of the suburban housewife decade, even with the full weight of culture and advertising and psychiatry pushing in one direction, women kept working. By the late 1950s, a third of American women held paying jobs. Not the high-skilled industrial jobs they had held during the war. Most of those had been lost, and they did not come back quickly. But jobs. Part-time clerical service sales. Women working in numbers that the dominant cultural narrative refused to acknowledge because it did not fit the story being told. The magazines were full of happy housewives. The television programs showed women in aprons. The psychiatry books warned of the dangers of feminine ambition, and meanwhile a third of American women were leaving the house every morning and going to work. Betty Friedan noticed this contradiction. In 1957, she was asked to conduct a survey of her former classmates from Smith College, all women who had graduated in 1942, the year America entered the war. Women who had been young and educated at the exact moment everything had changed. She expected to find them satisfied. The cultural consensus was that educated women who chose domesticity were fulfilled in ways that career women could not understand. What she found instead shook her enough that she spent the next 6 years writing a book about it. The women she interviewed were not satisfied. They were struggling with something they could not name, something that lived in the gap between the life they were presenting and the life they were privately experiencing. Friedan called it the problem that has no name. She described it as a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century, each suburban wife struggling with it alone, as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, put children to bed, and was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all That question buried private, carried alone by millions of women who each believed they were the only one feeling it was the thing the post-war project had almost succeeded in containing. Almost. Because the thing about a question like that is that it does not stay buried indefinitely. It accumulates pressure. And some women, even in the 1950s, even in the decade that tried hardest to put everything back, were already refusing the premise. Already doing something that the magazines and the psychiatrists and the advertising copy had not quite accounted for. Already saying no. And the price they paid for that refusal, what it cost them socially and personally and professionally, is where we are headed next. Not everyone complied. That is the thing the official story of the 1950s tends to leave out. The image we carry of an entire decade of cheerful women in crisp aprons, happy in their kitchens, untroubled by larger ambitions, is an image that was manufactured. And like most manufactured images, it was produced precisely because the reality was more complicated. Because scattered across that decade of conformity, in offices and laboratories and courtrooms and political offices, were women who had looked at the social contract being offered and said quietly and firmly, and at considerable personal cost, no, not me, not this. And what happened to them is one of the most honest stories this era has to tell. Let us start with a number. In 1957, social researchers conducted surveys asking Americans about their attitudes toward marriage and single life. The results were striking. 80% of Americans said they believed that a person who chose to remain single, who preferred not to marry, was either sick, neurotic, or immoral. 80%. 4 out of 5 people, not ambivalent, not mildly disapproving, sick, neurotic, immoral. Those 3 words covered the range of what it meant in the cultural consensus of 1957 America to be a woman who had decided that the domestic arrangement being offered to her was not what she wanted. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. Not because it is shocking, though it is, but because it tells you exactly what it cost to be a woman in that decade who refused. The cost was not just social awkwardness. It was not just raised eyebrows at the church social. The cost was being classified officially and popularly as mentally or morally defective. That is an enormous thing to absorb, and an enormous thing to choose anyway. The women who chose anyway were not a monolith. They were not all radicals or activists or women with political agendas. Most of them simply wanted to continue doing the thing they had discovered during the war that they were good at. Some had kept their factory jobs through the layoffs, either through seniority, through protest, through luck, or through working in industries that were less aggressively reassigning their positions to returning men. These women continued to work, navigating workplaces that were frequently hostile, earning wages that were consistently lower than their male counterparts, with no legal protection and no institutional backing. Some had used their wartime savings, those paychecks carefully accumulated over 3 or 4 years, to start small businesses. Dress shops, catering operations, bookkeeping services, the kind of enterprises small enough to be invisible to the cultural machinery that was monitoring women's ambitions. You could run a small business without becoming a political statement. And some had made the choice that the 1950s framed as the most aberrant of all. They had remained unmarried by design. Not because no one had asked. Not because they were, as the popular wisdom of the era would have it, undesirable or strange or somehow lacking, but because they had done the quiet arithmetic of what marriage in 1950 America actually meant, and concluded that the terms were not acceptable. There is a congressman I want to tell you about. Her name was Koya Knutson. She was from Minnesota, and in 1954 she became the first woman ever elected to Congress from that state. She was not a radical by any measure of the word. She was a practical, hard-working legislator who spent her time advocating for a federal food stamp program, funding for school lunches and federal student loans, things that helped ordinary families, things that by any reasonable reading served the exact domestic values that the era claimed to prize above all else. She was re-elected in 1956. She was building momentum and a record. And then in 1958, her husband, a man who had a complicated history of his own, publicly issued what became known as the Koya Come Home letter. Signed by her husband, publicized by her political opponents, it accused her of neglecting her family and her son, of choosing her career over her domestic obligations. Her opponent in the election that year ran with the slogan, "A big man for a man-sized job." She lost, by fewer than 1,400 votes. Koya Knutson lost her congressional seat not because of her record, not because of her policy positions, not because her constituents had found her wanting as a legislator. She lost because she was successfully framed as a woman who had abandoned her proper place, a woman who had chosen public life over private duty. And in 1958, America, that framing was enough. I find that story one of the most concise illustrations of what the era actually did to women who reached for something. Not a metaphor, not a composite, a real woman, a real seat in Congress, a real 1,400 vote margin. But what I find even more interesting than the stories of women who lost are the stories of women who won, who stayed, who kept working, kept building, kept refusing, and absorbed the cost of it without disappearing. There was a woman named Sophie Wolanski. We met her briefly before in the context of a wartime steel mill article, who had been celebrated on her plant's company newsletter in 1945 for her skill with the grinder and the drill press. The article had carefully balanced its praise of her work with reassurances about her domesticity, her needlework, her letter, writing her appropriately feminine hobbies. What happened to Sophie Wolanski after the war, we do not know specifically. The records do not follow individual women past the moment they were no longer useful to wartime industry, and that erasure is itself a kind of answer. The women who kept working in the 1950s mostly did so without fanfare, without news articles, without anyone calling them brave or pioneering. They simply showed up. To offices that promoted the men around them, to jobs that were classified as women's work, even when the skills required were identical, to a credit system that until 1974 in the United States legally allowed banks to refuse a woman a credit card in her own name without her husband's signature. Without her husband's signature, a woman could have worked for 20 years, could have been making a salary, paying her own rent, managing her own finances entirely alone, and the bank could still legally routinely require that a man co-sign her credit application. Because the law did not yet recognize her full economic personhood. That is the world the women who refused were operating in. Not a world that had simply failed to catch up with them, a world that was actively, legally, systematically organized around the assumption that they did not fully exist as independent economic agents, and yet they stayed in it. Here is a question worth sitting with tonight as you settle into the dark and let this story wash over you. What would it take for you to do something that 4 out of 5 people around you considered a sign of moral failure? Not a small thing, not a private preference, a public classification, sick, neurotic, immoral, the language your neighbours, your doctor, your government, your culture would reach for when they described your choice. What would it take to make that choice anyway? To get up every morning and go to work in a world that had built elaborate systems to explain why you should not be there? I ask, because I think the answer matters. And I think the answer for most of the women who did it was not heroism in any dramatic sense. It was not a declaration. It was not a political statement. It was something quieter, and in some ways more powerful, the simple refusal to accept someone else's assessment of what she was capable of. The factory had shown her. The paycheck had confirmed it. The 3 years of running her own life had made it permanent. She knew what she could do, and no cultural consensus, however loudly maintained, however extensively enforced, was going to override what she had learned in her own hands. The women who refused in the 1950s did not see themselves as founding anything. They were not, most of them, sitting around dreaming of future movements. They were simply living their lives in the only way that made sense to them given what they had become. But here is what they were doing without necessarily knowing it. They were holding a door open, not dramatically, not loudly, just standing in the frame, making it slightly harder for the door to close completely, keeping visible by their continued existence the possibility of a different kind of life. And the daughters who grew up watching them, who saw their mothers go to work in the morning, even when the television said mothers did not do that, those daughters absorbed something, not a manifesto, not a political education, just an image. A woman leaving the house in the morning, returning in the evening, managing her own money, answering to herself. And the daughters thought, watching her, oh, so that is also possible. What those daughters eventually did with that image, what they built from it, what they demanded, how they changed the structure of the world their mothers had navigated from the outside, that is a story that unfolds in the next chapter. But before we get there, let us spend a moment in one of the most overlooked places in this entire history, the home itself. Not the idealized home of the advertisements, the actual home, where women who had lived through the war were quietly, persistently, permanently different, even the ones who appeared to have returned to exactly the life the 1950s was asking of them. Because appearances in this era were doing an enormous amount of work, and underneath them something was already beginning to shift that no amount of dishwasher advertising could contain. The kitchen was gleaming. That is the first thing you would have noticed stepping into the average American suburban home in 1953. The linoleum floor freshly mopped, the refrigerator humming in the corner, round-shouldered and white, stocked with the week's groceries organized by color and kind. The table set for dinner at 5:30 because the husband came home at 6, and dinner was on the table when he did. From the outside, from the street, from the pages of the Ladies' Home Journal, it looked exactly as advertised. But step inside the woman standing at that kitchen counter, and you would find something the magazines never photographed. A woman who 10 years earlier had been building aircraft fuselages, or managing a household budget through 3 years of rationing with no one to help her and no one to ask. Or watching the street every morning for a bicycle that was not just a bicycle. She's returned apparently to where she started, but she is not the woman who left. The Milltown era begins in 1954. That is when the first of what would become known quietly and a little bitterly as Mother's Little Helpers hit the American pharmaceutical market. Milltown Meprobamart was the brand name, its promise peace of mind. Not sedation, not sleep, just calm. The feeling in pharmaceutical form of everything being all right. Within a single year of its release, 1 in 20 Americans had tried it. 1 in 20. That number is remarkable on its own, but what makes it genuinely telling is who was taking it. Women were prescribed minor tranquilizers at twice the rate of men throughout the 1950s and 60s. Twice. Valium, Librium, Milltown, the drugs that came to represent the chemical management of domestic life, were marketed almost exclusively to women. The advertisements showed them. Anxious wives, frazzled mothers, women with vague complaints and unspecified distress. And here is the part that requires a moment to sit with. Honestly, the doctors were not imagining the distress. The women were genuinely suffering from something. The question is what exactly they were suffering from, and whether take these pills and feel calmer was actually an answer to that question. Betty Friedan, writing in 1963, described the tranquilized housewife as one of the central images of what she called the feminine mystique, Not because the pills were working, but because they were being used in place of addressing what the pills were covering. The pills did not solve the problem that had no name, they made the problem quieter, which is a very different thing. Now, I want to be careful here because this story is more complicated than it is sometimes told. Not every woman standing in that clean kitchen was miserable. Not every woman taking a minor tranquilizer was being chemically contained. Not every woman in the 1950s was suffering from suppressed ambition or unfulfilled professional potential. Some women genuinely loved what they were doing. Some found real meaning and real satisfaction in the domestic sphere, and it is not honest to dismiss that as false consciousness. The home is not inherently a lesser place. The problem was never that some women chose it. The problem was that all women were supposed to. That choice in any meaningful sense was systematically removed. And it is in that gap between genuine fulfillment and forced compliance that the real interior life of the 1950s home lives. What was actually happening inside those gleaming kitchens, behind those freshly mopped floors, in the minds of women who had lived through the war and come home to a decade that needed them to perform contentment. Something that is very hard to document because it left almost no official record. It happened in conversations, in what mothers said to daughters when the television was off and the husband was in the other room, in what was left deliberately unsaid. The silence around certain topics, the conspicuous absence of certain ambitions from the vocabulary of household life. Women who had worked during the war, who had managed budgets and shifts and personnel decisions, who had in short demonstrated capacity far beyond what their kitchen required, carried that knowledge into the domestic decade, and they passed it to their children not through lectures or manifestos but through the texture of daily life. A daughter who watched her mother balance the household accounts with the same precision she had once applied to factory inventory. A daughter who watched her mother solve problems her father had not yet noticed needed solving. That daughter was absorbing something. Not a political education, not a set of explicit beliefs, something more basic than that. An image of what a woman could be that was wider than the one on the television. The suburbs did something particular to this process that I find genuinely interesting from a historical perspective. Levittown and the communities like it, and there were thousands of them springing up across the country through the late 1940s and 50s, were designed around a single model of life: the nuclear family, the private house, the separation from extended networks. In the towns these families had come from, the cities, the farms, the tight-knit ethnic neighbourhoods, women had lived embedded in community. Mothers, aunts, sisters, neighbours, a web of people who could share childcare, share information, share the daily labour of keeping lives running. The suburb replaced that web with a lawn. Women who moved to Levittown described in surveys conducted decades later the particular quality of the loneliness they found there. When asked what they missed most about their previous lives, many gave the same answer: their mothers, not their husbands, not their old neighbourhood specifically, their mothers, the intergenerational female knowledge, the company, the older woman who had already worked out how to hold everything together and was willing to show you. Suburban design had, whether by accident or intention, created an architecture of isolation. Each woman in her separate house separated from the woman next door by a lawn and a fence, separated from the older generation by distance and the logic of the new development, and yet women found each other anyway, not through official channels, not through institutions that acknowledge their needs, through the cracks. The National Housewives Register in Britain, founded in 1960 by a woman named Maureen Nicole, who wrote a letter to a newspaper suggesting that housebound housewives with liberal interests ought to form a network that organisation still exists today. It started with a letter from a woman who was lonely and suspected she was not alone in being so. In the United States, similar organizations formed book clubs, parent-teacher associations, neighborhood councils, church groups that quickly became something considerably more political than their organizers had initially announced. Women who had no official outlet for their competence built unofficial ones, quietly, domestically, in ways that look perfectly appropriate from the outside, and in those spaces, around kitchen tables and in living rooms and at meetings that were technically about something entirely else. Women talked about more than was perhaps expected, about what they wanted, about what they had had for a few years and what it had felt like, about the question that sat at the center of the decade and had not been named yet but was being felt everywhere: is this all? There is one more thing I want to tell you about this period, about what was changing inside the home quietly without headlines. By 1960, twice as many women were employed as had been employed in 1940. Twice. In the decade that was supposed to have put women firmly back in the kitchen, in the decade of the happy housewife, the gleaming kitchen, the tranquilizer, the number of working women doubled. Most of them were married. Most of them had children. Most of them were doing it quietly, without fanfare, folding their paid work into the domestic performance that the era still required. They were not making speeches. They were not organizing publicly. They were simply going to work part-time clerical service, whatever was available, and bringing home money that gave their households a different kind of stability than the single-income model the advertising world was selling. And in the process, they were creating family by family, year by year, a new set of facts about what American women actually did, facts that sat in quiet contradiction to the official story being told by the magazine covers and the television programs. The official story said, women are at home. The actual data said women are also at work in growing numbers and have been throughout the entire decade that everyone is pretending they stayed home. That contradiction between the story being told and the reality being lived is a pressure system. And pressure systems, when they build long enough, find a release. The release, when it came, did not arrive from nowhere. It arrived from the daughters who had grown up watching their mothers manage both the housework and whatever else needed managing. The daughters who had absorbed, without being taught explicitly, a picture of female competence that was considerably larger than the one being offered them by their school counselors and their college admissions materials. The daughters of the post-war generation came of age in the late 1950s and early 60s. They went to college in larger numbers than any generation before them. They had grown up inside the contradiction, the distance between what they had seen their mothers capable of and what the world was still stubbornly telling them women were for. And some of them, looking at that gap, decided they were not going to paper over it. They were going to name it. What they named it, and what happened when they did, is where this entire story has been heading. But before we arrive at that ending, we need to spend a moment with what history forgot to record. The women who built the world we're describing, and whose names are missing from the story. The ones who are not in the textbooks, not in the iconic photographs, not in the narrative of progress that we have constructed retrospectively to explain how we got from there to here. Their absence from the record is itself a kind of record, and we owe it to them to notice it. There is a particular kind of erasure that is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not burn records or prohibit the telling of stories. It simply quietly, systematically, over a long enough period of time, stops pointing the camera in certain directions. And if you only ever look at the photographs, you will believe that what was not photographed did not happen. That is what occurred with a very large portion of the women's history of World War II. Not a conspiracy, not a single deliberate decision, just the accumulated weight of who gets celebrated, who gets the memorial, who gets the textbook chapter, and who gets quietly folded back into the general landscape of things we vaguely know happened but do not think to name. Tonight I want to name some of them, When most people picture a woman war worker from the 1940s, they picture the same image. The woman in the blue denim coveralls, the red bandana, the white skin. And that image is real. It represents real women, but it represents only a fraction of the women who are actually there. More than 500,000 black women historians call them the Black Rosies, and I find that phrase both apt and insufficient, worked alongside their white counterparts in the war industries, in shipyards, factories, administrative offices, railway yards, doing the same work, logging the same hours, contributing to the same national effort. And they did it while navigating something their white counterparts did not. Because the executive order that technically banned racial discrimination in defense industries, Executive Order 8802, signed by President Roosevelt in 1941, was in practice routinely ignored. Employers hired black women last after the white labor pool was exhausted, and then placed them disproportionately in the most dangerous and menial positions. Night shifts, janitorial slots, the tasks the other workers did not want. Black women who had college degrees were assigned to clean floors. That is not a metaphor. That is documented. That happened. And the iconic image of the wartime female worker, the one that became the symbol of the era, the one we still use to represent the contribution of women to the war effort, does not include them. There is not a single recruitment poster from the entire span of the war that features a black woman. Not one. Let me tell you about a woman named Betty Reed Soskin. She was born in 1921 in Detroit. During the war, she worked as a file clerk in the segregated black auxiliary of the Boilermakers Union in Richmond, California. Her union hall was in a separate building from the white workers. She never saw the ships being built. She filled out change of address cards for workers who were constantly relocating the same workers who were pouring into boomtowns like Richmond, faster than the housing could absorb them. I was filling out change of address cards, she said years later, to save the world for democracy. The dry, precise irony of that sentence. She understood the contradiction she was living inside better than anyone who later tried to explain it from a distance. After the war, Betty Reed Soskin went on to open a music store in Berkeley, become a community activist, work in politics, and eventually, at the age of 85, join the National Park Service as a ranger at the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park in Richmond. She continued working at that park until she was 100 years old. When she retired in 2022, she was the oldest active ranger in the history of the National Park Service. She spent those decades at the park doing something specific and deliberate, telling the story that the park itself, with its Rosie the Riveter branding and its white bandana imagery, had not been designed to tell. The story of the black women, the ones who did the work, the ones who were not on the posters. Betty Reed Soskin died in December of 2025 at the age of 104, and in every interview she ever gave about her work she returned to the same point. The official history is not the complete history, and if you accept the official version without asking who is missing from it, you are not learning history. You're learning the story someone decided to tell. The 6888. That is their nickname, and it comes from their unit number, the 6888th Central Postal Directory Battalion. They were 855 women. They were the only all-black, all-female unit to serve overseas in the United States Army during World War II. And for most of the time since 1945, almost nobody knew their name. In February of 1945, the 6888 arrived in Birmingham, England. They had crossed the Atlantic dodging German submarines. They had arrived in Glasgow and narrowly avoided a German rocket. And now they were standing in front of 6 warehouses unheated. Rat infested their windows, blacked out against night raids filled to the ceiling with undelivered mail. 17 million pieces. Letters from mothers to sons who might already be dead. Packages from wives who had not heard anything in months. Care packages from children who did not entirely understand where their fathers were, only that they were somewhere that required sending cookies. The army had estimated it would take 6 months, possibly closer to a year. The 6888 ran 3 8-hour shifts 7 days a week around the clock. Their motto was simple: no mail, low morale. They cleared the backlog in 3 months. After Birmingham, they were sent to France, where they did it again. 17 million pieces of mail sorted and delivered to millions of American soldier and government workers in conditions that most people would have considered impossible before these women walked in and made them possible. When they came home in February of 1946, there was no ceremony, no parade, no recognition. They returned to the United States on a ship and then dispersed quietly into civilian life. Their commander, Major Charity Adams, who became the highest-ranking black woman officer in the army during the war, did not receive significant public recognition for her service. She wrote a memoir in 1989. She was honored by the Smithsonian in 1996, and then on February 28th of 2022, 77 years after the 6888 arrived in Birmingham, the House of Representatives voted 422-0 to award them the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States Congress can bestow. President Biden signed it into law in March of 2022. Of the 855 women who served in the Unit 6 were still alive to receive it. 6 out of 855. Take a moment with that. 77 years. Of those who waited long enough to be acknowledged, 6 were still there to hear it. Here is the question I want to ask you, because I think it matters enormously. Why does this happen? Why does it take 77 years? Why does it take a letter from a daughter who happened to be a congresswoman before the story gets told? The honest answer is because the women the story was about were not considered the default subject of history. The default subject of history, the person whose story gets recorded automatically, whose contributions get noted without prompting, whose service generates memorials without lobbying in 1945, America in 1955, America in 1985, America was not a black woman. Was not any woman often enough? History has always been in part a record of who got to decide what mattered. And for a very long time, that was not the people most of us are talking about tonight. I find myself thinking as I sit with these stories about what else is missing. Not just the black women. The Mexican-American women who worked in defense plants in Texas and California, doing essential work living under segregation, ineligible for many of the benefits that white workers received. Their wartime contributions are almost entirely absent from the popular record. The Japanese-American women who, while their families were being held in internment camps on American soil, still managed to find ways to serve nurses, clerks, translators, women who worked within systems that had simultaneously locked up their parents. Their stories are filed in archives that the history textbooks rarely mention. The women from all backgrounds who worked in industries that are not glamorous enough to appear in the iconography, the railroad workers, the laundry workers, the women who kept the invisible infrastructure of wartime domestic life running. Women whose work is undocumented not because it did not happen, but because nobody thought to write it down. And the nurses, we talked about them earlier, but even there the record is incomplete. Because over 1,000 women received military decorations for courage under fire. Over 1,000. And the names of most of them are not in any popular account of the war that the general public could name. What does it mean to be erased from a story you were genuinely part of? It is not simply an injustice to the person involved, though it is that obviously and deeply. It is also a distortion of the record that everyone else inherits. When you teach a simplified version of history, when you reduce the women's wartime contribution to a white woman in a red bandana, or to the factories and the paychecks and the eventual return home, you're not just leaving people out. You're making it harder for everyone who comes after to understand how things actually changed. You're hiding the friction, the complication, the layered reality of who was doing what and under what conditions and at what cost. And that makes it harder to think clearly about who is doing what now and under what conditions and at what cost. Betty Reed Soskin once said something that I have thought about many times since I first read it. She said we need to refuse the polished version, not because it is wrong exactly, but because not entirely wrong is not the same as honest. And the women of this story, all of them, the white women in the factories and the black women in the segregated union halls, the nurses on the beaches and the spies in the mountains, the pilots who flew 60 million miles and waited 33 years for recognition, the mothers in the suburbs who asked, "Is this all?" and the daughters who eventually decided the answer was no, all of them deserve a story that is honest enough to include the parts that are inconvenient. The double discrimination, the erasure, the 33 years, the 77 years, the 6 women left alive out of 855, because those numbers are the story, not just the backdrop to it. The story of what women did in World War II is not just a story about courage in extraordinary circumstances. It is a story about what happens when a society asks everything of people, and then decides afterward that those people do not quite fit the narrative it wants to tell about itself. And what the women did with that, what they carried forward quietly into the decades that followed, is where this story ends. Not with a resolution exactly, but with a door that is still in some important ways being held open. We're almost there. The last chapter of this story is the one that circles back to where we started the woman who refused to go home, and what that refusal eventually became. On February 19, 1963, a publisher named W. W. Norton released a book into the world. They had printed 3,000 copies, 3,000, which is the kind of print run that suggests someone believed in the book but was not entirely sure anyone else would. They were wrong. Within weeks the book was on the bestseller list. Within months it had sold 1 million copies. Within 3 years, 3 million. Eventually translated into a dozen languages, read by women in living rooms and libraries and kitchens from New Jersey to Nebraska, to rural England to Japan. The book was called The Feminine Mystique. The author was Betty Friedan, and what she had done in that book was give a name finally after nearly 2 decades to the unnamed thing, the problem that had no name, that strange stirring, that sense of dissatisfaction, that yearning that each suburban wife had struggled with alone, convinced she was the only one convinced because every authority around her said so that the emptiness was a failure in herself. Friedan received hundreds of letters from women in the months after the book came out. Hundreds turned to thousands, and what the letters said again and again in different words from different lives, from different cities, everything just clicked. That phrase, "everything just clicked," is one of the most significant sentences in the history of this story. Not because of its drama, because of what it tells you about what had been happening in the interior lives of women for the previous 18 years. The problem had existed since at least 1945, since the factories closed their doors to women, since the men came home and the world snapped back into the shape it had been before the war, since the magazines decided what women were for and the psychiatrists provided the clinical language to back the magazines up. The women had been living with it the whole time, in private, in silence, each one alone with a question she could not quite articulate, and that the world around her refused to acknowledge. Is this all? What Friedan did was not solve the problem. She named it. And naming something, especially something that has been unnamed deliberately, is an act of tremendous power. Because the moment you have a name for it, you can find other people who have it too. And the moment you find other people who have it, you realize it is not a personal failure. It is a structural condition. And that shift from something is wrong with me to something is wrong with the arrangement is where movements begin. The speed of what followed is worth understanding. In June of 1963, the same year The Feminine Mystique came out, President Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act. It was the first federal law to prohibit wage discrimination based on sex. It was not perfectly enforced. It did not close the gap immediately, but it existed now. It was on the books, which means it could be cited, appealed to, built upon. In 1964, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act banned employment discrimination based on sex as well as race. The sex provision was actually inserted by a congressman who hoped it would make the whole bill seem so radical it would fail to pass. It did not fail, and the sex provision stayed. In 1966, Betty Friedan helped found the National Organization for Women, 30 women from different backgrounds convening in a hotel room, drafting a statement that called for the full participation of women in American society on truly equal terms with men. By 1968, the women's liberation movement had become impossible to ignore. None of this happened in a vacuum. None of it appeared from nowhere. It had been building since 1942. Since the first woman tied on her bandana and walked into a factory and discovered she was capable of things nobody had told her she was capable of. The movement of the 1960s did not create women's desire for equality. It inherited it. It named it. It organized it. And it demanded in ways that the previous generation had often been unable to that the world take it seriously. But here is where I want to come back to the women of this story. The women who are the actual subject of what we've been talking about all through this long night together. Not the famous ones, not the ones in the textbooks, the ordinary ones. The woman who built aircraft and got laid off when the men came home. The woman who hid her wedding ring to keep her job. The woman who stood at the window every morning with her coffee and checked the street for a bicycle that was never quite ordinary again. The woman who wrote to her returning husband, "I am not exactly the same girl you left. I am twice as independent as I used to be." The woman in the segregated Union Hall, filing change of address cards, doing her small part to save the world for democracy. The 855 women who sorted 17 million pieces of mail in unheated warehouses in Birmingham, and came home to no ceremony, no parade, no recognition, and lived out their lives in quiet knowing exactly what they had done. Those women did not see themselves as the origin point of a movement. They were not thinking as they tied their bandanas and clocked in about the decade that would follow or the movement it would produce. They were thinking about the work, about the paycheck, about the letter they would write that night, about whether the bicycle would come tomorrow. But here is what I believe, having spent a great deal of time sitting with their stories, they changed anyway. Without intending to, without a manifesto, the factory changed them. The paycheck changed them. The 3 years of making every decision themselves changed them. The loneliness, the competence, the camaraderie changed them. Even the pressure to go back the decade-long campaign of magazines and psychiatrists and advertising that tried to put the genie back in the bottle, even that changed them. Because resisting something, even quietly, even without naming it, changes the shape of who you are. Do you know what I find most remarkable about this entire story? Not the factories, not the war effort, not the statistics on divorce rates or college enrollment. It is this. The women who went to work in 1942, most of them had never planned to be part of anything historical. They went because the country asked, because they needed the money, because the work was there and they could do it. They did not think of themselves as making history. They were just living. And yet the accumulation of all those individual lives, all those quiet daily choices to show up to do the work, to keep the paycheck, to maintain the checking account, to teach their daughters that a woman leaving the house in the morning is not an aberration, but a possibility, all of that accumulated into something that could not be undone. The feminine mystique did not create the women's movement. The women who had lived through the war did. Friedan gave the movement its language. The women gave it its foundation. Millions of them, most of them without names in any history book. Let me tell you where I think this story ends. Or rather, because stories of this kind do not really end where it finds its resting place. It rests in a very simple image. A door, not a grand door, not a symbolic door. A door like the one we talked about at the very beginning of this story, when a man in uniform came home and stood on the porch step, and a woman stood in the doorway and looked at him for a fraction of a second and saw a stranger. That same door. Through that door she'd walked out every morning to a factory or an office or a union hall for 3 or 4 years. She'd walked back in every night. After the war, when the world asked her to stay inside, some women did. Some did not. Most did something in between. But the door never looked the same. She knew it opened both ways now. She knew what was on the other side. And that knowledge carried quietly forward through the gleaming kitchens and the Milltown decade, and the television programs showing women in aprons. That knowledge found its way to her daughters, who found their way to their daughters, who found their way to this moment. A futurist named Alvin Toffler once said that Betty Friedan's book pulled the trigger on history. I think that is almost right. But I would say the trigger was pulled in 1942 in a factory in Ohio, or a shipyard in California, or a mailroom in Birmingham, England, by a woman who picked up a rivet gun, or a welding torch, or a pen for filing change of address cards, and discovered in the doing of ordinary work in extraordinary circumstances that she was someone. The world had underestimated that discovery. That was the trigger. Everything else followed. We've been travelling a long way together tonight, through the factories and the letters and the loneliness, through the reunions that were not quite what anyone had imagined, through the decade that tried to put everything back, and the millions of women who went along with it on the surface while something else entirely was happening underneath, through the erased histories and the names that are missing, through the 6 women who received a medal in 2022 that 849 of their sisters did not live to hold, through the problem that had no name and then finally had one, and through the quiet, daily accumulating refusal of women who would not go back to a smaller version of themselves. I want to leave you with one last thought before you drift towards sleep. The next time you do something that was not available to the women who lived before you, hold a job you love, manage your own finances, make a decision that used to require a man's signature, know that somewhere in the ancestry of that freedom is a woman in a factory in 1942 who had never earned her own paycheck before, and who on the day she received it understood for the first time exactly what was possible. She refused to go back, and the world changed because she did. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for spending this night with me and these women, for staying awake or half awake for the ones who didn't get the ceremony, for the ones whose names never made it into the textbook, for the ones who sat at the window every morning and checked the street for a bicycle. Their stories deserve to be told. I hope somewhere in the quiet of the night you carry a piece of them with you, and if anything from tonight stayed with you, a face, a moment, a sentence, leave it in the comments below. I would love to know what landed. There is another story waiting for us. A different era, a different set of women, a different door opening onto a world that had not quite expected them to walk through it. Rest well. I will be here when you are ready.